This is Doug Carlberg. I'm president and CEO of Carlberg Consulting Group, and I'm on the executive board for the San Antonio Manufacturers Association. Today, we're in here doing a podcast, Lead With Me, on leadership with Ed McCormick.
Hi, Doug. It's great to be here.
I'm glad we're able to get up with you. I mean, you and I have been chasing each other now for about, who knows, quite a while.
That's all will they, won't they situation.
But, as I got to know you, you really have a very interesting history and career. And I'd like to go down history lane, a little bit of your journey right now, and talk about it. So you start off in the Air Force Academy.
That's right. Yeah, I spent 4 formative years of my college age at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. My father was in the Air Force, but his Air Force experience was pretty mixed. And so when I had the opportunity to go there, he was not a huge fan of that decision. Most people will say their parents were ecstatic that they would go to a military academy. My father was a little hesitant just because of his Air Force experience, but it was the right opportunity for me, Doug. I wanted to be an astronaut. That was the goal, and I went there with that was the plan, and the plan didn't work out, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But it was a great experience to be there, to really kind of find out what kind of mettle you have as a person and how you really kind of work with people under some pretty tough circumstances. To find those lessons out about yourself and other people that early on in your career, so to speak, was a very powerful and shaping experience.
I can imagine, and I've going back memory lane myself. My dad was a retired Air Force. He retired as a 06 colonel. And my brother went to the Naval Academy.
Okay.
And I was going after wanting to go in West Point.
Yeah.
And I totaled a car between my junior and senior year and couldn't pass the physical. But that didn't stop me from getting enlisted and going in the Army and becoming a helicopter pilot. So, yeah. I mean, during Vietnam, if you could walk, talk, and chew bubble gum, they took you, except for the West Point. But anyway, it worked out for the best for me. I thought it was great. So tell me what you did after the Air Force Academy.
Yeah, well, it was a really interesting, experience. So at the Academy, I got the opportunity to compete for a Rhodes Scholarship, over in England.
Well, that's a big deal.
It was. I didn't get it, but that put me on a path of other people took notice. And I was offered another scholarship to go to the University of Illinois. So right out of the academy, my next stop was a Big Ten school in the middle of Illinois. So I had this sort of very structured, and structured with a capital S of experience at the Air Force Academy. And then they dropped me off in the middle of Champaign-Urbana, and I'm a second lieutenant. I get paid, and my school's paid for, and I have housing. And so I went to grad school there, and that was a much more exciting experience, much more fun. But also, I got a chance to work with some really, really smart people.
It's a great college.
It's a great college, yeah. I was there, and the economy of that whole college is built around the poor grad student, right? And so I roll in with like a small amount of money. Second lieutenants aren't daddy warbucks, but for Champaign-Urbana, I was, I could, chicken wings, you got it. I got it. Pitchers of beer, I can handle. I got you there too. But the most important thing was I worked with some really, really smart people. I was sent there to get a degree in engineering psychology, which sounds a bit, dichotomous at the outset, but it was really understanding how the human factors into complex system design. Right. So there's things that computers can do, and there's things that people should do. And this was 1995. So this is well before AI or anything like that, where those lines have gotten a lot blurrier. But at the time, I was there to learn how to design complex systems. See, we studied, nuclear reactor incidents. We studied air traffic control systems. We studied a lot of complex systems that have both machines and humans in them. And I was there to kind of redesign or have the optimal design of who should do what. And I did it in a year. That was the deal. The Air Force gave me 1 year to get that done. It was interesting. There, people were like, "You're in all my classes." I'm like, "I'm in everybody's classes." I had to take all the fall classes in the fall, all the spring classes in the spring, and write a thesis along the way. But I did that for a year, and then the Air Force said, "Well, we need you to do some real Air Force work." So they took me from Champaign-Urbana, and I went to the Mojave Desert out in Southern California, and that's where I got to do some flight test work for the B-2 stealth bomber. At the time, that was still being tested. And
state of the art at the time.
State of the art at the time, and so that was a great gig. At this point, I'm about 22 years old, Doug, and I'm flying 4 days, 5 days a week. It's a great life. I wasn't the pilot. I was in the back of the plane running instrumentation. Basically setting up the test runs and figuring out what the plane was doing and what the plane was not doing according to the designs. And so it's very interesting to be 22 years old. You're up there and you've got a test pilot who's gobs of experience. He's flying the plane. You've got literally hundreds of people on the ground doing all kinds of measuring and fingers crossed that this is going to work. And they're all listening to me, this 22-year-old kid, and because I'm basically the one calling the shots at that point with the gear I have. If it's not right, we got to go around, do it again.
A lot of responsibility.
It was a little, it was one of those things. I think I didn't realize it at the time. I probably would have been too scared to do it. But at the time I was up there doing it, then I came back down and people were like, okay, well, we had to go, you realize when you did this, we had to completely redesign that.
Well, that's what the military is all about. I don't care what role you are. And if you got the ability, they will push you out there.
Absolutely.
And give you the skills to lead. That's what it all comes down to.
Yeah. And that's been a big part of I'm glad I learned that lesson early on, Doug, because that's been kind of a theme throughout my leadership journey and my career is that, there's opportunities that come our way, right? And sometimes those opportunities don't present themselves in a nice, pretty box with a bow. Sometimes those things come to you and they're not under great circumstances, but you take those opportunities, even begrudgingly at times. And, hindsight's a wonderful thing. You can look back at it years later and realize that was a big change in my career, or that was a big opportunity. I'm glad I took advantage of that, even if at the time that was the last thing I wanted to do.
So what did you do after Mojave?
So I spent about 3 years in Mojave, and then they told me I was coming to San Antonio. And
tough duty when you can get it.
Yeah. Well, at the time, I had never really spent a lot of time in Texas, and so I had all the preconceived notions of Texas. Right. I was gonna come in, and there was gonna be tumbleweeds rolling down the street, and Wyatt Earp was gonna be my neighbor. But I got here, and again, the work was just tremendous. I landed in San Antonio. I went to work at a research laboratory. And again, at this point, I'm a first lieutenant, pending on captain very soon after. And, I was given the reins to run a lab. I had PhD level people, on one side. I had, blue collar manufacturers.
That must have been over at Brooks, right?
It was, yeah. That was over the Brooks, at the time, now the city base. And now I think it's just Brooks, south side of San Antonio here. And it was the Air Force Research Lab was kind of the Wild West back then. I mean, there were a lot of competing programs, and so everyone was kind of fighting for their place in the sun. And we had a small but mighty group of people. I had PhD level people over on one side that would dream up these fantastic things, and I had blue collar people over here on the other side that were in charge of. They were the engineers who had to build the things that the PhD white coats came up with. And I had a third group of people who were these young kids, really 19, 20, 21, who were computer programmers who had to code at the time the thing. So 3 competing different populations that I mean, honestly, Doug, they didn't speak the same language, let alone get along with one another. Right?
Well, how did you make that all happen? How do you make that into a team?
Yeah. That was again a very lesson I learned early in my career, and this was the chance to put it into practice. I think what came back to it was focusing first on the mission. Right? You had 3 groups, and none of them were inherently doing anything wrong. They thought they were doing something that was in the best interest of the program, and it just so happened they were going about it 3 different ways. And so the first thing I wanted to do was to bring some of the people who were using this technology. And I can't go into the technology here, but, we were building apparatus for special forces folks. And, that was a huge plus, right? Whenever you can bring a special forces team or even a few members of special forces into your lab, those people are just motivation incarnate, right? They talk about their mission and what they have to do. And, people get really excited. And so I brought them in, and sometimes I took the team out to see them out at Hurlburt Field in Florida. And they would, and they would talk about the mission. They would talk about, the danger and people they had lost. And you could just see, the walls come down amongst those 3 different populations because they were like, this, we're doing this for that individual. We're doing this individual. We're doing this for his team, his family, their mission, not our mission. And immediately that started opening people up to being receptive. And then it was just creating the venue, right? I mean, they would sit, and they were physically 3 different buildings. And while I didn't have the juice as a captain to rearrange, building assignments, I created like a shared space. Like we come here, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and here's where we work together on something. And it was part of it was social. I wanted them to get to know one another a little bit more. They didn't know each other's names at the start, and 2, I wanted to create a place for them to interact, right? And start to where I could also interact with them as their leader and say like, we're going to solve problem X today. This is what we're working on. And, all 3 parties are in the room, and let's just hash it out, right? Engineering, what are you facing? Well, we've got a voltage constraint. We can't produce this type of effect. The scientists would, then have to come up with what effect could be similar that may not have the same engineering constraints. And we would go from there.
Well, that's pretty amazing because you learned that early in your career. I mean, I learned that later in my career when I was responsible for new product design and trying to figure out how I could get and reduce the cycle time in half. And the way we did it is we took everybody that had a piece of the pie and put them all in the same complex.
Yeah.
And with open cubes.
Yeah.
So we had everybody from the design engineering side to the quality team to the sales team to the procurement team to the manufacturing engineers. And with a theory of constraint approach to that, we actually reduced the cycle time by 60%. Yeah. So it works. But to learn that as a captain early in your career, that is just amazing.
Yeah, I'm like 26 at this point.
Which is, I was a little older when I figured it out.
I guess they figured I needed to learn it faster, Doug, it's and it's one of those things that you and I were, ahead of the curve, right? Now everything is an open shared workspace, right? Walls are kind of a thing of the past. But at the time that was big.
It was big. I mean, it used to be referred to when I took that thing over. Well, they throw the design over the wall.
Absolutely,
they wouldn't talk to anybody. This is my design. Figure out how to make it work.
Yeah. It's like and I'm dating myself here, but like it was literally like a Manila envelope would show up in the in the mail, right? And it was like these are the specs. Build that, and it was like there was no human interaction about it. So, that was one of the first things I had to.
So the question is, after Brooks, did you get out or did you go?
Yeah. No, I was at the time. Now we're up to about 2002, and as the story goes, I met a girl. Right. Yeah.
I know. Well, that's how it works.
That's how it works, right?
When I met my wife, met her on a plane coming out of Montreal. She was from San Antonio. We were flying back to San Antonio because I had a plant here in San Antonio, and when I realized I really wanted to marry her, I knew I could never get her out of Texas.
It's a package deal.
Yeah, it's a package deal for sure. You know?
Yeah. And, I met my wife and she had moved around a lot. Her father was in the Air Force, so she had moved around a lot. And I had moved enough, through my career to know that, the 2-year or 3-year rotational lifestyle was nothing that we wanted long term. I loved my career. I loved the opportunities it afforded me and the people I got to meet. But I knew I wanted to kind of put some roots down. And so, we made the decision together to get out of the Air Force this time. And so I got out as a captain. Fortunately, some of the people I met in the laboratory had sort of preceded me out the door, and they were at USAA. And so they
Great company.
Fantastic company. And, it's as a place to go after the military, that's pretty much the best place you can go after the military. It has such a strong military affiliation. They understand the military culture. And so, coming out of the military, going into USAA was...
Well, and it's amazing because I was reading your bio.
Okay.
The way they picked you up and put you, and tell me a little bit more how they put you in human development over there.
Yeah, it was very interesting. So, as I've said, up to this point in my career, I'm doing project design, program design, delivery of technical programs. And at the time, USAA had, they've gone back and forth over the years, but at the time they had a decentralized project management model. So if you were a project manager for IT, you were hired by IT. And over other times in their existence, they've centralized that. All the project managers will work in one spot, and you would be hired there, and then you'd be sort of farmed out. But at this point, they're decentralized. And so the people I knew were doing kind of project management, programmatic work in HR. And HR. And so they're like, hey, we got a spot for you over here in the HR team. I'm like, HR? Really? Like, what?
What's that?
What's that? Like personnel? Like, I don't have that background. But and they're like, no, that's fine. You'll be great. So I came over there and essentially what I did for, my first 18 months at USAA was, I just worked projects, and I was in this HR team and I asked at the time, can I be, if I'm working with the staffing team, one of the first things we did was bring in a new applicant tracking system. USA hires a lot of people and they wanted to have a system that could do that well. And so they brought that in, and kind of the lessons I learned at the laboratory, Doug, I wanted to be with the people, I wanted to be with the team that did this work. And so I asked, can I sit with the recruiters? Just find me a little desk over there. And so I did. I sat with the recruiters. And I ran the project, did all the things I needed to do, but I was like inundated, the sounds and the noise, the vibe, so to speak, of what a recruiting team does. I could hear them on the phones. I could hear them struggle with the current system.
Well, and you were learning their process, which is key.
Absolutely. Right. I was learning their process from watching them do their process, right? Which is different than you bring someone into a room and have them write it on the board, because what they write on the board is how the process was designed.
Not how it works.
Not how it works. Exactly right. So I saw them cutting the corners because the design process didn't make sense. Or I saw them using another system, because the current system wouldn't support what they needed to do. And that's a great way to capture requirements, right? So when you get into a session with the leaders, you ask them about the process. You always do. And they start, describing the ideal process. But then I could say, well, I noticed some of the recruiters were doing all this stuff in Excel. Like, why would they put this all in, a separate system? Well, I didn't know they were doing that. Well, yeah, they do. And that's probably because of X, Y, and Z. So you kind of are able to pressure test with your sponsors and stakeholders. And that, I picked that up just by, living and breathing the air of that team. So I did that. And I did that. I washed and rinsed and repeated that process a couple of times. And over the first couple of years of my career, I had just cycled around HR, learning different processes because they were doing a different system upgrade. So I learned applicant tracking and recruiting by sitting with the recruiters, doing a recruiting project. I learned how the people that do the employee relations, the investigations, sort of the darker side of HR, how they do their work, because we were putting in a new tracking system for that. Compensation, likewise, and then learning and development, same there. So fast forward a couple of years later.
Well, I got a quick question before we go fast forward. So did you reduce the cycle time for hiring people as a result of that?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, the system, I mean, we did. And not only did we reduce the cycle time, we gave the candidate a much better experience. We were starting, at that point, people were really starting to focus in on the UI, user interface, user experience, that was starting to really kind of take hold at USAA. And people, asking people to go through 15 different screens to apply for a job, people started to realize like, hey, that's, people aren't completing their applications. We started to get data that showed they get to page 5 and then they just stop.
Well, and probably you didn't realize it, but if you ever studied the Toyota production system, they basically call that value stream mapping.
Yeah.
To identify what it takes and what the non-added value time is to eliminate the non-added value time.
Right.
And then you take that value stream and then you apply it into what we call a Kaizen event, which is continuous improvement event. And the word in Japanese for Kaizen is break apart and put back together again. So you add the two together, and the results, if it's in HR or if it's in manufacturing, is amazing.
Absolutely, yeah. And a lot of times we found that HR is a lot of regulation, right? So it was you've got to get these pieces of information to make sure people are paid well and that they're verified within the system, especially within finance. But it was like, when do you get that information? Right? We were asking all that information up front before the person even is interviewed for a job. We're giving them essentially fill out this 15-page this 15-page thing, and if we like you, then it'll move forward. Well, a lot of people were filling that out and they weren't going forward, so it became a point of frustration. So it was also kind of to another manufacturing model, like just in time, right? So we gave them just enough that we needed to move on to the next step. If they made that next step, then we gave them a little more to fill out. And also, at that point, they're motivated, right? I passed the first interview. I'm going to the second interview. Now I got some more paperwork to fill out for that second interview, but I'm motivated because I passed the first. And, it was a better experience for the candidate, which when you're in, we found out even later in my career, when there's a war for talent, you've got to make sure that candidate feels good throughout the process.
It's the whole onboarding process is key.
Absolutely. Very key.
So from there, where do you go?
Yeah. So I did a couple different stints at USA. Again, I had this broad HR background without ever intending to be in HR. And HR at the time, USAA was kind of growing beyond their physical footprint here in San Antonio. So they needed to find buildings outside. And the decision was made to look in other metropolitan areas for the talent that they needed. And one of the places they wanted to go was into Dallas. They were looking to grow their IT talent and their investment side of the house. And this is about 2010, I think, at this point. And, but they had never done that. Outside of building the large building here in San Antonio, growing outside of that complex was a very new muscle, very unused muscle there. So again, I was sort of asked, voluntold, as they say, to go in and be kind of the HR person on that project. And it was amazing, Doug. It kind of like back to my Air Force career, things I never imagined myself doing. At the time I was like, I don't think this is an opportunity. I think this is going to be a pain. But it turned out to be a wonderful opportunity because I learned, I was now working with construction teams and design teams and architects. And it was funny when you're the HR person, everything becomes a people question.
Oh, yeah.
Right. They were asking me, one of the times they were asking me, we were looking at a building and they wanted to make sure it was a safe building and that people could be there. People could be safe during a weather event. And so they asked me, they're like, well, from an HR perspective, how many people need to fit into the stairwell in case there's like a tornado event and people need to
Well, up in Dallas, you got to think about that.
That was a legitimate question, right? And so they're asking me like, well, how many people does it need to fit, Ed? And I was like, I'm an HR guy. I'm like, I don't know, all of them. That was my response. I'm like, I think we should try to save everybody. Let's make sure the stairwells fit all the people. And they were kind of like, okay, HR has spoken. It must hold all people. But, I'm like, I'm not qualified. I think they were looking for some science behind that answer. But, at the time, you make decisions with the information you have.
At the time.
And it's another, lesson as a leader, people look to you for the answers. And you have to be honest about, I'm making this decision with this much information. I wish I had this much more, but, it's time to be decisive. And so, here's your answer.
You kind of made an interesting move after USAA.
Yeah.
You went over to Whataburger.
That's right.
And I'm looking at your resume. You hit it right at the transition from the time it was transitioning from the family-owned business to a corporate-owned business. So you were actually going in trying to reestablish the culture there. So that's a major shift.
That was a major shift and completely unknown. People ask like, well, were you brought in to facilitate this? And it was like, no. I came in, and I think that decision for the family, was an incredibly personal one for them to sell, and so that was extremely close held, and I had no clue of that. But when that decision came out. You have a company that for 75 years at the time had been family owned. And when you sell to a private equity firm, people assume a lot of things are going to happen. You're going to be split up, or they're going to, grossly, change the menu or whatever, all the things that showed up in the paper after that, the sale was made public. And the good news is, at that for Whataburger at the time, like, the things that the customers saw, the things that the customers experienced changed very little. They didn't change the menu, right? And they didn't, change how the people operated within the restaurant. Things were changing behind the scenes in the corporate office. At the time, Whataburger was growing, very slowly, very deliberately with the family. They were protecting the legacy that, that the father had started when he built that company. They were protecting it. And when they were growing very deliberately. They wanted every store opening, every restaurant opening to be an absolute home run. And when they sold, so we were building 4 restaurants a year. They sold to the private equity firm, and literally, within 2 to 2 months, we were ginning up plans to open about 50 restaurants a year.
Wow.
Right. So it was an amazing kind of overhaul of the system. The work I was brought in to do at Whataburger was to really kind of oversee what they were calling the talent management organization. So the recruiting, the training.
Similar to what you were doing at USAA. A little bit.
Yeah. But now I was kind of given like the full mantle, right? And the interesting thing, I'll focus just on the staffing because that was the majority of my time. When you go from opening, 4 restaurants, which have about 100 people in it to start roughly, to, 50. So you're hiring, 400 new employees plus all the employees that rotate out in a normal fast food organization. You're going from hiring 400 new employees to now you're hiring, 5,000 new employees, And, we were hiring, I think at one point, Whataburger was processing like over 100,000 W-2s every year. That doesn't mean we had 100,000 people in our workforce, but, the workforce that you have within a fast food, or they call it, fast casual restaurants is somewhat transient.
Yeah, a lot of turnover.
I think we were at like 150% turnover, and we were like one of the best. So that creates a challenge on your staffing organization because you're constantly filling, right? You're constantly filling. There's never a time where you're not recruiting because you're always just building up for the people that are going to leave. And then you have to go in and, from your training perspective, you have to make sure your training is on point and ready to go to onboard those people like we talk about. We want to give them a good onboarding experience, but also it's got to be, very focused and very designed so that you're not spending a lot of time in a classroom, and because you need those people out in the restaurant, making a difference. So that was a very, very large transition. So, the challenges as a leader at that point is to take something that was moving one direction, again, very white glove kind of staffing service, a lot of contact with the recruiter, a lot of contact with the people along, in the process. And then when you start, basically going, 100x on your recruiting, we had to make some process changes. You had to automate some things. You had to make sure that enough bandwidth was dedicated to the people who were needed to make those hiring decisions. And so it moved, we moved into a much more of a production line, automated kind of place, just to handle the volume. And you mentioned culture, and that was very important to us because we did not want to do that while sacrificing
and
the
it's amazing to me. You go into a Whataburger today. I've been going to Whataburger for over 20 years, and the culture's the same. It hasn't changed.
Yeah. They've that's good to hear. That's good to hear. Because they worked very hard. I almost said we, but we did work very hard, and then they continue to work very hard to maintain that. There's a lot of great people still in that organization, and especially within the HR team and the talent management organization that do a fantastic job of getting, they call it getting people orange for the orange color of the Whataburger signature color, and kind of getting people that that feeling of like we belong, right? And they do a fantastic job.
That's a lot to be proud of. I mean, it's an amazing journey in turning that whole thing over to a high production type or operation, and not losing the secret sauce is what I call it.
Yeah.
I'm really excited. Let's move on to what you're doing today, because this is what really excites me. It really is out there to help manufacturing, especially small manufacturing. You're with a joint venture with NISC, which is the government, and UTSA, I believe. And it's called CyManII, right?
CyManII, yeah. So we are, CyManII stands for Cybersecurity Manufacturing Innovation Institute. So CyManII. And CyManII's, been in existence for several years now. And CyManII is a very unique organization because it is ideally focused to help manufacturing secure its operations, right? So we talk about, speed to market is a common phrase you'll hear in manufacturing, and it's an important one. Productivity is important. We focus on secure to market, right? So you can move fast, but if you open yourself up to vulnerabilities, if you open yourself up to bad actors having been able to manipulate your product or your supply lines, obviously that could lead to some pretty horrific things. And so that's CyManII's focus. We have engineers and educators who work in CyManII, and their job is to build, we're not building firewalls and we're not building virus detection. We're building architecture that secures the whole system. And that's a big undertaking. And a lot of cybersecurity focuses on, preventing threats after they have happened or detecting threats. We try to really be through an architectural approach, through a basic sciences approach, to be there kind of to prevent entire categories of threats from being an issue. And my role in that, it kind of harkens me back to my laboratories my laboratory days, Doug. My role is, I oversee what is called a technology hub, which is an initiative out of the Department of Commerce. CyManII is funded by Department of Energy.
Okay, I thought it was NISC.
No,
I just learned something.
Yeah. DOE
but I knew it was coming out of the government.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, so the Department of Energy funds CyManII. They're great, wonderful partners. My particular effort is this technology hub is funded by the Department of Commerce. And, and much like you would expect from the Department of Commerce, they are looking for practical solutions that are going to affect, in this case, the South Texas region, and they are looking for cybersecurity in manufacturing for the South Texas region. And so, you imagine that the laboratory, once again, is creating all this wonderful technology. And this is not an issue that's limited to CyManII. Any laboratory environment has the same issue, that it works well in a laboratory. We find it works fantastic in a laboratory. And then we try to take it into an operational setting and things don't work. I'll go back to some of the work I was doing at the lab in my Air Force days. We were designing things for special forces. And we had all the requirements. This particular piece of equipment needs to do this, this, and this. And we built it all to that. And it was a nice, clean box. And we handed it off to the special forces guys we explained how to work it. And they were like, great. So first thing they do, Doug, they take it, put it into a helicopter, and they fly up and they do like a combat infill, right? Basically, they're practicing coming in fast and hot, and they're in this helicopter. And we're like, what are they doing with the helicopter? Where are they going to land this helicopter? Well, they didn't land the helicopter, right? They rappel out. Yeah. And they take our fancy piece of equipment and just toss it out of the helicopter. So this thing that we built in the laboratory falls 35 feet, 40 feet to the ground and smashes into a million bits. And we were just like, we were aghast. We're like, why did you throw it out? And they're like, well, that's what we do. That's what we do. That's our job. And to them, it was like, it's like we shouldn't even have to tell you that that's a requirement, that we're going to toss things out of helicopters at 40 feet. And so we're like, oh, all right. So back to the laboratory we went, and we brought in something that could survive that. So that's, fast forward, that's where we are in a normal laboratory structure today, right? So we have things that work in the laboratory, but then we want to try to take them, in our case, to a manufacturing floor. Is it going to work? And is it going to work in a way that makes sense to the manufacturers, right? So if we wanted to create a tool that makes them so secure, but it shuts down their supply line, or even degrades their supply line, or degrades their operations on the floor, that's not a solution. And we understand that, right? Things that we need to do things that will still allow them to produce their widgets on time and in the process they have. But we got to do it in a way that now allows those same processes and machinery and equipment to be secure.
But you're also doing a lot of education too, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So like I said, CyManII it has an engineering team, and then we have something called our education and workforce development. And if you've been part of some of the events with SAMA, which is a great partnership, San Antonio Manufacturers Association is a wonderful partner. CyManII is a gold level sponsor with them because we believe in what SAMA does, and SAMA sees the value in CyManII. But if you're at any of those events, you'll probably see this giant, almost like an RV. And that is our mobile training vehicle. We call it the MTV. And again, I'm dating myself. When I say MTV, I still think of the music television, but my kids don't even recognize what that is. But our MTV is this large RV where people can come in, and it's for students, grade level through, high school. But we've also have events there where we train, adults.
These are the manufacturers. Matter of fact, we've had a number of manufacturers go through some of your training, which is free, by the way.
Absolutely,
it's a great, especially with the new requirement coming down with DoD, which is this NIST 800-171 cybersecurity requirement that all defense contractors have got to meet, even the small guys.
Yeah,
it's a great learning experience going through that thing, going, wow, I really need to do this, or I need to learn that.
Yeah.
And I understand you're bringing the van to the San Antonio Manufacturers Association.
Absolutely.
Basically, conference and trade show coming up here in April, May the 7th.
May the 7th.
It's coming up here pretty quick.
Yeah, we're going to be there. I saw the layout with the SAMA team, where we're going to be placed, where we got a good spot. We got a good spot this year. So we are looking forward to that, and people are welcome to come and tour it. And again, it's education. People can take, small groups can take classes there. But to your point, it's really a great exercise facility, right? So you put people in there, decision makers within an organization, and you can simulate a cyber attack, right? And then you've got your decision makers in the room and say, okay, you just lost this. What do you do? And you can, either develop your procedures through that exercise or pressure test your existing procedures. Like, okay, do we contact the media? Do we contact lawyers do we contact? What do we do in this situation? And it's a great avenue. It's a great stage to work through all that.
Yeah, man, if you haven't thought about attending that trade show coming up in conference,
It's
you
great.
need to. This is a free service. It's a great educational thing. Learn how you can take it back to your company and how it can be applied. I've got 3 leadership.
Right.
You've had a great career in leadership, so I always end up with 3 leadership questions. Can you share a story in the past that had a profound impact on your leadership?
Yeah, I think it harkens back to some of the things we've talked about, Doug. But I think the most important one early on in my career was the lesson of being flexible to the mission. Right. I think some people, myself included, right, at early in my career, you came in thinking that I'm here to do X job. In my case, I had just come out of graduate school. I had this fancy degree. I thought I was going to show up to the B-2 bomber and redesign their cockpit systems, right? To make them take that complex human machine interaction and turn it into something really fantastic. But I showed up again, second lieutenant, and the colonel at the time, I'll never forget. He asked you what do you do here? Why are you here? And I explained, I'm here to redesign your system, so your information systems and your cockpit systems. And he's like, no, you're not doing any of that. You're not doing any of that. He's like, those requirements have been locked. We're well down the path. And he literally, Doug, handed me like a phone book. It was a book about like munitions and how to drop bombs and how the test cases for bombs. He's like, this is where we are in the program, and you are now going to learn to do this. And at the time, we talked a little bit about this. At the time, I was really disappointed. I thought I was coming in to do X, but now I'm. The mission requires me to do something different, and I think that was the first big lesson. Was like, to really have an impact, you have to embrace the mission that's in front of you, right? And be open to that. Like, lend your strengths, and my strengths weren't in dropping bombs, but I had, an engineering background. I had a kind of a mind for trying to figure out, how systems can work better, right? At the time, and now we would call it like a process engineering mindset, right? At the time, it was just like, I just like figuring out how things work. And so, with that kind of disappointment / enthusiasm, I kind of dove into it and I started reading the phone book. And fast forward, several months, I'm doing this new job and I'm learning new things, right? And I'm able to make an impact. And I think as a leader, that's also, we find ourselves in times, we come in, we want to do X, Y, and Z. And you have to adapt to what the situation gives you. That doesn't mean you lose sight of the mission, right? But sometimes the mission has to take on a higher order, right? Like my mission going into that situation was, I'm going to redesign the cockpit. And when I got there, I had to refocus my mission as I want to deliver, an airframe that is capable of doing the mission and bringing our people home safely.
Okay. That's interesting. How did your style and leadership change over time?
I think the main thing I've seen as a leader is that and it may sound somewhat counterintuitive to what the answer I just gave, is that that sometimes you have to focus in on what you can do as a leader, and sometimes you have to let some other things go, right? So while as a leader, I've adapted over time to say, I'm here to affect, this change at this time. And that doesn't mean that I'm in charge of it all, right? I think that was part of it, was that I thought at times early in my career that I had to come in and I'm the leader, so I have to have all the answers, right? I have to be the one that I know, if they ask a question, I need to have the answer. And that puts a lot of pressure on people, right? Especially young leaders or leaders who are any age really. To if you're thinking that you have to have all the answers, that's a tough place to be. And so over my time, I've learned that I've just got to accept that fact that I don't have all the answers, but I'm surround yourself with very smart people, and sometimes people that think very differently than you, right? I often think back to Abraham Lincoln, right, and his cabinet of rivals, right? He had 3 people, I believe it was his Attorney General, Secretary of State, and his Secretary of Treasury on his cabinet, and those were people that all ran against him in that 1860 election. Right?
Pretty interesting.
Right. And so, he brought in smart people, even people that disagreed with him. And, what they were able to do, right, leading up to the Civil War and what they were able to withstand through that because they had those differing viewpoints, smart people, but different viewpoints, and how they turned that into a strength.
And I read that biography of Abraham Lincoln. It's an amazing story.
Amazing.
His story. And one of the things that I applied in my career is I basically am a big supporter of Myers-Briggs, 16 different personality types,
right,
to help put a team together. And back then, he didn't even know about Myers-Briggs, and he did it.
No.
It was just amazing. My last question for you is, how do you inspire and motivate your team, especially in these challenging times that we're going through right now?
Yeah, no, that's I think everybody's going through that, leaders or not, even parents, are trying to motivate their kids. Uncertain times are difficult, right? And I think, again, as leaders, people look in these uncertain times, they look to their leader. They look to their boss or their parent or their mentor and say, like, help me through this. And I think, again, sometimes you don't have the answers. I mean, no one's got the answers for what's happening next, in our current environment, right? As, I work in a government laboratory, and every day, everyone's waiting to see what executive order, is going to drive some change. So even in the face of all that uncertainty, I think leaders, the number one thing they can provide is hope, right? Give your people a reason to stay motivated, right? Reorient them with the mission, right? Like I did, bring those people, those end users to your meeting. Let people see who's going to use your product at the end stage, right? Manufacturers, like, go out and see how your tech is being used. Keep your people motivated by focusing them on the mission. And I say bring them hope, not false hope, right? Don't sit there and lie to them and tell them everything's going to be great, or the solution is just around the corner. If it's not, people are smart, and you want smart people working for you. And if you don't give them the true sense of the situation, smart people are not going to stay working for you. So I would say that's the biggest thing, is bring people hope. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes as a leader, you have to think really hard about what is hopeful in the situation that you're in right now. But that's the challenge and the burden of leadership, is that you've got to find hope. And again, true hope, not false hope, but work hard to find the challenge in it. We find ourselves in situations now where funding may or may not, be available for continued work. We're not alone. But I think, that's, the hope there is that we've built really great things. People understand the value that we bring, and that will open us up to new funding opportunities. That gives us an opportunity, gives us the challenge, the mandate to go find new funding opportunities, which allows more people to see the great things that we have built.
I tell you, those are 3 great takeaways that you shared with us today, and it's a great story in your career all the way up. If you want to spend more time with Ed, you need to come to the South Central Texas Trade Show and Conference coming up here at down at the Frost Center at the Expo Hall behind there, coming up on May the 7th.
Yeah.
They're going to have their trailer there. I've been through it more than once. It is just amazing. And Ed, thank you so much for spending the time with us today with my podcast series, Lead With Me. This is Doug Carlberg signing off and looking forward to the next one. Stay tuned. Thank you, Ed.
Absolutely, Doug.